Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with the group again, and always happy to do it. This is a picture of Wuhan, China, where it all started, and we can, as you can imagine, this is a pretty big city with 11 million people in it, and this is where the SARS-CoV-2 virus spread like wildfire with what at the time seemed like an astounding number of cases, 70,000 cases over the space of 2 months. Currently, yesterday in the United States, we had 136,000 cases reported. So the 70,000 seems like chicken feed at this point in time. So just to walk you through some basic science, SARS is a coronavirus. We divide the world of viruses into two parts, those that have DNA as their genetic material and those who have RNA as their genetic material. The DNA viruses tend to be big, like pox viruses, like chicken pox, and herpes and stuff like that. And while the RNA viruses, polio, for example, Ebola, tend to be smaller. But this is in the land of RNA viruses, the SARS-CoV-2 and the coronaviruses in general are fairly large. And what that means, that's a good thing, because they have an enzyme that can repair their RNA. So as they replicate, they have the ability to correct errors in their RNA. So for that reason, they remain relatively. They don't mutate as much as say HIV mutates as they go from one generation to the next. So that's good for us for vaccines and therapeutics. The coronaviruses have these are viruses of animals and humans. There are a number of different subgroups. You all probably have been infected with the alpha coronaviruses before, which cause up to 30% of upper respiratory infections in adults around the world. But then there are the beta coronaviruses, and the beta coronaviruses are bad actors. We have the original severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, which emerged in 2002 in China and swept around the world. We also have something called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, M-E-R-S, which is the second one. And now this new virus, which we call SARS-CoV-2, the SARS coronavirus type 2. All the coronaviruses, the alphas, the betas, whether they're bad actors or whether they're relatively benign, have a spike protein on it. And if you look at this virus cross-sectionally, it looks like a crown, hence the name corona. Not named after the beer, I'd point out. And over here is what this looks like. Here's the viral membrane here, this part down here, right? And as you go up, this is what the spike looks like. And at the tip of the spike is a protein loop that we call the receptor binding domain. And if you think that this is kind of a lock and key, this is the part of the protein that fuses with the receptor on the cell wall of epithelial cells, of the lining cells of the respiratory tract, and causes with that locking in, then this spike protein fuses, the whole virus fuses, and it disgorges its genetic material into the host cell where it sets up shop. The part of the cell wall that it binds to is a receptor called the angiotensin converting enzyme type 2 receptor. And yes, these are the same things as angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, or ACE inhibitors, which many of you may take for hypertension. But don't worry, this doesn't make you more vulnerable or less vulnerable. The ACE2 receptors are found on the membranes in the lung, down deep at the alveoli, which are the breathing sacs at the end of the bronchi, in the upper airway. And remember that the conjunctiva, the eyes of the eyes, is part of the respiratory tract, and they have ACE2 receptors on them, and then also the glandular cells of the GI tract. This virus is spread by 3 ways. So this is how you get the virus out of someone who's infected and into someone who's susceptible, or originally out of an animal that was infected and into someone who is susceptible. These are bats mostly that have these beta coronaviruses. So the most typical way of spread are from large respiratory droplets. And by large, I mean tiny, like more than 5 microns. And they're big enough to go out and fall to Earth with just with gravity. And that's the magic of 6 feet, which is, at WHO land, they say a meter and a half. But it's about, I think 6 feet's probably as good as probably, you want a little bit more distance, not less. So those are, if you inhale one of those or if it hits you in the eye, that's how you get it. Because these things have the virus adhered to the outside of the droplets. These are, spheres. And that's how you get the virus gets introduced into your respiratory system. And then it's the viruses leave the respiratory droplet, bind to cells, and start to cause infection. There are also smaller droplets that are less than 5 microns in diameter, and those can remain suspended in the air. This is a big problem in intensive care units where you have the lower tract of the lungs instrumented with, for instance, for endotracheal intubation and ventilation. And so those are, these smaller droplets can come from deeper in the respiratory tree. And so when you do things like put a catheter down to suck out mucus or fluids, you can create sprays, and those are highly infectious. In real life, outside of hospital ICUs, airborne spread is probably much less common than we fear, and I could frankly count the number of outbreaks on the fingers of one hand that have occurred around the world that have been clearly documented as being caused by airborne spread. It's actually probably much more common than that. It's not vanishingly rare, but it probably only accounts for a few % of all cases. But as we come back in the wintertime, where air can be rehandled and recycled through heaters, we may see more of this. And then finally, there's fomite or surface transmission. This is somebody who coughs or sneezes. It hits a surface like a table, for instance, or I think of the poles in the New York City subways. And then you go and touch it, and then you rub your eye or rub your nose, and you inoculate it directly. This form, which is a form of transmission, which was really a big thing with SARS originally in 2002, is probably very, very unusual for SARS-CoV-2, and there are not a lot of well-documented cases of transmission. So droplet spread is far and away the most common. I told you about the ACE2 inhibitor before. And you say, what's a respiratory droplet? Think of going out in the cold and breathing. And that, when you say, I can see my breath. Those are respiratory droplets. Okay. Now, the natural history of this disease, and I'm going to give you the timing here, and then I'll come back and talk about how many people are in each of these boxes. So you get exposed on day 0. You inhale the virus infects cells, and it starts to make more viruses. Right? So the whole business about viruses is that they're just pieces of RNA in this case, or DNA in other cases. They enter a cell, a human cell, they get converted to DNA. Their RNA gets converted to DNA. That gets taken up in the host's genome, and the machinery of the cell is taken over. So instead of doing what it's supposed to be doing, it becomes a factory for making viruses. So it takes about 3 days to get enough virus around, to get high enough levels of virus that you can actually measure it with a test called polymerase chain reaction, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But these are the PCR tests that you hear people talk about. But people are still asymptomatic. By day 4, people will have high enough virus levels that they become infectious. And so when we talk about transmission, we talk about pre-symptomatic transmission, and that's this phase here. By day 5, the people who are going to develop symptoms, and they're relatively mild: fever, cough, fatigue, myalgia, muscle aches and pains, loss of taste and smell. Diarrhea is not uncommon. They're infectious for the first few days of this phase, say from days 4 to maybe 8 post exposure, but then it drops off. And by the end of 12 days post exposure, unless they have deep lung disease, almost everybody has stopped shedding virus. Now, in a handful of people, so we refer to that phase as the virologic phase. In a handful of people, they'll progress into a second week of disease with pneumonia. And they can progress more rapidly than that. And they present with respiratory distress, with pneumonia. They often will need ICU admission, occasionally will need mechanical ventilation. And these people will remain infectious. These are relatively uncommon, but they may remain infectious for up to 20 days. Now, mixed into all of this is that about 40% of patients develop no symptoms during the course of their illness. So looking at it a different way, there are 40% who are asymptomatic, about 30% who are mildly symptomatic, who have no dyspnea, means difficulty breathing, no shortness of breath, no abnormal chest x-rays. And they're, these oximeters, pulse oximeters that you can clip on the end of fingers, and they tell you what your blood oxygenation levels are. There's really oxygen saturation. That'll be equal to or above 94%. You can have more moderate disease. So when you move from mild to moderate, there's some evidence of lower respiratory tract disease on exam or on x-ray. The Chinese actually used chest CT scans as a way to diagnose this. But the partial pressure of oxygen, your oxygen saturation, will continue to remain high at or above 94%. These people can be managed as outpatients unless they're very elderly or have a lot of underlying conditions. And then you move into people who really truly have problems with oxygenation. It's below 94% on room air. Their respiratory rates are elevated. They have pathology on X-ray or a chest CT scan, and they have severe illness. That's about 10%. And then about 5% of people that progress to frank respiratory failure, septic shock, or multi-organ system dysfunction. And again, that's about 5%. Those are the people in the ICU, and those are the people who die. These terms get thrown around a lot, and I want to really be careful in using them. The infection is with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The clinical disease is called COVID-19, which stands for coronavirus infection 2019. So it's the year, and it's a coronavirus disease, right? That's the D is disease. So COVID-19 is the disease, SARS-CoV-2 is the infection. If you're asymptomatic, you have SARS-CoV-2 infection, but do not have COVID-19. So why do some people move from here to here to here to here? Well, there are a variety of factors that predispose people to having more severe disease. Age is one. Older people tend to progress. Younger people tend not to. Active malignancies, chronic renal disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart disease, variety of different types of heart disease, type 2 diabetes mellitus, obesity with a body mass index of greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared of body surface area, smoking, sickle cell disease, and if they've had a solid organ transplant. There's some others that are kind of mixed. I would put hypertension over in a strong predictor. Pregnancy, CDC thinks is a predictor. I have a whole series of every Brazilian woman who was with COVID-19 that says otherwise. So we have kind of dueling series right now. And then there are a variety of other things that more data are needed on. We know pretty well that HIV doesn't tip the balance, or if it does, it's very small. To give you a little bit of science here, let's concentrate first on the PCR. And this is from a nasopharyngeal swab. These are the ones where they go back up into here, right, to get it. So that will turn positive. So you have sort of an intermediate point here where they actually can measure it. It'll turn positive, and then it will remain positive for quite a while. and it will take basically weeks to come down. It can come down faster, but I'm not at all surprised when people are still PCR positive 3 or 4 weeks after they've recovered. You can also isolate virus, which is really what we're talking about. This is the viral, when the virus is replicating most rapidly, and that's when people are infectious. This is when they have the highest viral loads, and they're the most infectious. So here's kind of an arbitrary cutoff here, and you can see around day 4 they become infectious, and that persists to day 7 or so. Okay, and then around day 10, which corresponds with the virus dropping off, you'll get a immunologic reaction with the development of antibody, both the acute phase ones, IgM, as well as the longer term ones, IgG. So you can see the antibodies are of no use for diagnosis because they come after the infection's over. And we rely heavily on PCR, but also on other tests that detect pieces of the virus, viral protein, and these are so-called antigen tests, and these are the rapid tests that you may have heard about. I'll come back and talk about testing later. Now, so we have these antibodies that develop. These are all these antibodies here that develop, especially the IgG, that persist for a while. Okay. There are lots of different types of antibodies, but there's one type that we want, which is the type that binds to the receptor binding domain or the spike protein, and that keeps it from being able to attach to a cell. And those are called neutralizing antibodies. This is a large series, as I recall, from Shanghai, where it measured neutralizing antibodies. You can see that out of these 175 patients, maybe a little less than like 8% had no antibodies at all, right? Another group had relatively few, so low was 30% overall, medium low was 17%, medium high was 39%, and high levels were in 14%. This is just measuring them after they've at some period of time after they've recovered, and these are neutralizing antibodies. So you can see there's a real differential response to for developing neutralizing antibodies. We also know that, like all antibodies, neutralizing antibodies wane over time. Now, they may come back because we have cells, memory cells, that remind the immune system, oh yeah, we've seen this protein before, spike protein, for instance, and we're going to develop a whole bunch of antibodies, and that's called an amnestic response. But at least looking at this originally, this is a study in Vanderbilt. There were 18 healthcare workers who had high levels of neutralizing antibody at baseline because they'd been infected, right? As you followed them, 2 months later, only 42% of those had measurable antibody. So it drops off below a measurable level in a lot of people. Interestingly, 6 of 8 people who were symptomatic were persistently seropositive, so that's 75% of those, but whereas only 2 of 8 who were asymptomatic had persistence of antibodies. Now, that wasn't significant, and 8 and 8 add up to 16, not 18, I realized just now looking at this. But the point is that people who are symptomatic may have more robust immune reactions than people who are asymptomatic. But I think the real take-home message here is that 58% of healthcare workers lost their neutralizing antibody within 2 months. So that may be a problem. But these are my favorite kinds of studies. These are all kind of experiments of nature. So a very large U.S. commercial fishing boat from Seattle with a crew of 122 set out on a cruise in August. There was a group from the University of Washington who went out and drew blood and checked for COVID-19 as they were going out. During the cruise, somebody who had tested negative because they were caught in the window period in those 3 days before the virus before the PCR turns positive, developed COVID, and there was an attack rate of 86%. Now, when they came back and measured everybody's blood, 3 crew members had neutralizing antibody from prior infection. None of them got infected during this outbreak, whereas of the 117 that didn't have neutralizing antibody, 103 became infected, and this was highly significant even with these low numbers. So this would suggest that in the face of re-exposure, if you have existing neutralizing antibody, you're protected. Now, to throw into this mix is the whole thing about reinfection. And there are a handful of cases around the world. The most compelling is from a 33-year-old, they're all pretty compelling, but to give you an example, a 33-year-old man from Hong Kong who had 2 diagnoses of SARS-CoV-2 infection 4.5 months apart. The first one was mild, and the second one was asymptomatic. The second infection was acquired in Spain, and he got picked up because they screened people at the border coming into Hong Kong. So they had an example of they had a saved specimen from his earlier infection and this new one, and they were able to compare them doing whole genome sequencing, and it turns out that they were different virus, different strains. They were genetically unrelated, aside from being SARS-CoV-2. So this is the most compelling story for a true second infection rather than prolonged viral shedding. The good news here is that he was asymptomatic the second time around. There was a man in Nevada, in Reno, who was reinfected relatively quickly, about 2 months after his first infection, same kind of laboratory thing. But the second time he became more symptomatic, which is something we worry about a lot with this virus and with other viruses. There is a entity called antibody dependent enhancement, where it's worse the second time you get it than the first time. This happens, for instance, in dengue fever, and there was some concern that this might be happening. But this is so we have some cases where they were asymptomatic the second time, and this one case where they were more symptomatic the second time. I think the thing to take home from these cases is that as a rare phenomenon, reinfection can occur, and it occurs something on the order of about 4 months later, and that would suggest that maybe there is some waning immunity. And that could be problematic. There may be a lot more of these going on, and we just don't know it. Now, the other thing that goes on in the dynamics of viral transmission are so-called superspreading events. These are exposures that occur from one person, and a whole bunch of other people are infected. And this is a list kind of from an earlier review of people looking at the proportion of people who are infected at sort of larger events. Here's a meal with 47 people, 10 people were infected. Here's one with, this was in France. This is a pretty well-publicized outbreak. 11 people were exposed, and 5 became infected. So we know from these series that superspreading is a real deal. And this suggests that transmission is driven by a relatively small number of high-risk close contacts. And if you'll allow me the indulgence of scrolling back here for a second, that's because this is truly a case of wrong place, wrong time. What you're doing is you're catching people in a crowd when they're there at the most infectious part of their illness. One of the first people in New York to spread it to 122 other people. We know that at the White House Rose Garden, there probably was a super spreader there, and they spread it to, I don't know, whatever the final tally was, 20-odd people, and transmission's still occurring from that cluster, as you know. The Chief of Staff Meadows and Secretary of HUD, the doctor, the neurosurgeon, whatever his name is, both became infected. And likely, I would imagine, are sort of secondary cases from this original cluster. But it's people, what you're doing, it's not that anatomically different, like they have a big nose, or there's something immunologically different. No, they're just there during this period of hyperinfectiousness. And what they think is in Hong Kong, they've looked at this really carefully in Hong Kong. They think about half the cases are sporadic cases. They're from a single, there's one person exposes one other person, whereas about half the cases are spread events where there's more than one person, where one person infects more than one other person, and it's there's some math around this that we could walk through. Some people have estimated that 80% of cases are caused by 20% of people who are just at this wrong time, saying the wrong place, wrong time, doing the wrong thing, I might add, this is what happens. And here's just to give you an idea, put this a little bit more. So here's this period of highest viral load here around day 4 or 5 post exposure, right? So this guy at this point will infect both people with whom he comes in contact. Whereas if you look out here farther after the viral load drops, you come into contact with 5 people and only one of them will become infected, right? So that's what this whole idea of super spreading is, and this is just sort of more math about that. But again, think wrong place, wrong time, like this, right? So these are the cases: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, I always like the military officers back here because they all have masks on. You see how many masks there are in this crowd? 0, maybe. And I thought that would be a great kind of combo, compare and contrast. There's one guy with a mask. Compare and contrast little study to do. So that's about epidemic dynamics. I want to switch now to epidemiology and kind of where we are with this virus now. And I'm going to start off talking about the world, then the U.S., and then California. So there have been more than 50 million cases worldwide that have been diagnosed and reported, and 1.2 million deaths. If you look at the leading countries, the U.S. is far and away in the lead, followed by India, whose case counts are starting to come down, Brazil, France, Russia, Spain, Argentina, the United Kingdom, Colombia, and Italy. I think one thing that people underappreciate is how heavily infected Latin America has been. Mexico, Peru, Ecuador all could be on this list. Panama, Costa Rica have taken big hits from coronavirus. This is by WHO region, and WHO regions, North and South America, are grouped together. This is the summer surge in the U.S., and you can see how it's still, we still have lots of cases here in the Americas. This is South and Southeast Asia, so this is mostly India, to a little extent Bangladesh. This is Europe. Europe is really having a tough time right now. This is the Eastern Mediterranean, cases largely in Iran. The blue is Africa, with cases mostly in South Africa. And then finally the red, or whatever color that is the Western Pacific, and that's China. You can see this is the Chinese outbreak back here, right? This is when this all started. And they've done a good job. China, Korea, Taiwan, all those countries have done a good job keeping a lid on this. This is what's going on in Europe. These are death rates, by the way. This is mortality, these cases of deaths. Here we are in Europe with an early surge. This is all these horror stories from Italy and Spain. This is what's happening with the case counts now. So you can see this is much worse than it was before. And before everybody can say, oh, but the death rates haven't come up, they are coming up in Europe, right? So we're up to, 20,000 deaths per week across Western and Central Europe. This just gives you an idea of where there are lots of cases around the world right now, with Western, Central, and even Eastern Europe heavily impacted. I talked about the Americas. There are a few other little places. This is Jordan, Georgia. Who else is really dark brown? anyway, they gives you an idea of where their cases right now. In the United States, we're well into our third wave of this epidemic. This was in April, May. This is when New York, Connecticut, New Jersey were so heavily impacted. This was in the summer, where this was mostly in the Sun Belt and the South. And now it's taken off in the mid part of the country with rapid accumulation of cases. And we've had more than 100,000 cases a day for the last week. There were up to 10,191,000 cases, and there were 130,000 reported on November 9th. I'll get into the geography of this, but there are very few places that are spared. If you look at where the cases have risen most in the past 7 days by per capita, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Wyoming, Minnesota, Montana, Illinois, and Utah, so that cluster of states in the upper Midwest, Great Plains, and the Rockies. But absolute numbers of cases, Illinois, Texas has the most number of cases in the country, Wisconsin, California, just because it's a big state, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, Indiana, and Iowa. You can also see the number of deaths here in the United States and what that epidemic looks like. There have been 238,776 deaths as of yesterday, with 745 on November 9th. And you can see that we're running, sort of flirting with about 1,000 deaths per day, which is all preventable, unfortunately. This gives you an idea of where these kind of early clusters of disease were. So this is when it was mostly in New York and the upper Midwest. I can't remember what this was. This looks like Columbus, Georgia. There was a big outbreak in New Orleans and Detroit early on. And then in the summer, it became very prevalent in the South and through into the Sun Belt into California. And then more recently, you get these big spikes here. This is a month ago, by the way. These big spikes here in the middle of the country. And this is, in fact, what the current map looks like. Red here is bad. And just look at the number of cases. This is per 100,000 in Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, Indiana, Missouri, even down into Tennessee and Arkansas and Oklahoma. You can see, and then all out through the populated parts of the Great Plains and the Rockies, including the Intermountain West here in Salt Lake City and its environs. So this thing is really spread like wildfire. And in fact, the only states that are seem to be doing relatively well right now are New Hampshire and Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and Hawaii. Last week I was saying California, Oregon, and Washington were doing okay. I think it's finally caught up with us. Here we are in California. I gave a talk a week ago when we were here at this point. I was saying, well, maybe we dodged a bullet. No, we haven't dodged a bullet. And we've had almost 1 million cases in California. We had 8,000 new cases on Monday. We've had 18,000 deaths and 29 more deaths on Monday. The most cases in the past 7 days were in the big Southern California counties. Not big in terms of size, but big in terms of population. Los Angeles, San Bernardino, San Diego, Riverside, and Orange. And then in the Valley, Sacramento, Fresno, and Kern. And here in the Bay Area in Santa Clara and Alameda. And if you look per capita, you get into, why are these things counties? Like Alpine County? Give me a break. How do we know this is real? Because hospitalizations are going up. And this is statewide. This is all hospitalizations. These are ICU hospitalizations. And you can see, we're not that far different with this thing trending up than we were back in April. We have a lot of capacity, but we may need more. Some other points here. This is just looking at the positive, the proportion of tests that are positive. It's now gone up from a low of about 3.2 up to 4.1% most recently. And the other thing is there's a statistic called the effective reproductive number, which is abbreviated as R sub E or R sub T if you're British. And what we want that number to be is less than 1. And what it means is it's for every case of COVID-19 or for SARS-CoV-2 infection, how many secondary cases are there? If I have SARS-CoV-2 infection, how many people do I infect on average? And what you want this number to be is less than 1. If it's 1, everybody infects one person, it becomes endemic in a population. If it's more than 1, it's reflecting spread through the population and growing prevalence. If it's less than 1, it's declining. And we've kept it less than 1 here in California for quite a while, but over the last month it's crept up. And we're currently, I think today, at 1.14 for the R sub E, which is out of control, and it needs to be brought back down. Now, just gives you, what the curves look like in these counties. As with many things in California, Los Angeles, the largest county by far, drives the train. And these are peri-urban parts of these, not San Diego, but Riverside, Orange, San Bernardino, are all the kind of parts that are near Los Angeles. And unfortunately, here in the Bay Area, both Santa Clara and Alameda are trending up as well. Here in the immediate Bay Area, these are the 9 counties of the Bay Area. You can see we have not avoided this spike. It's gone up from about 400 cases a day to maybe about 600, 700 cases a day, with this big, huge jump on November 9th. This is not good, and it reflects a lot of transmission. Fortunately, deaths remain relatively low here. Not that any death is, we can't discount deaths, but compared to some places, these numbers are pretty low. In most of September and October, when I gave these talks, these numbers were going down. All the cases were going down, with the exception of Sonoma, which has had a lot of problems, largely because of the fires. At least that's what it seems like. That people who were infected, who were isolating at home, had to come out, and they ended up infecting a lot of other people as they had to evacuate their homes. These colors represent the state's tier system, which I'll talk about in a second. But this gives you an idea. So that in Sonoma County, there are 11.1 cases per 100,000 per day. In San Francisco, it's much smaller, 1.7 cases per 100,000 per day. And then these are the county level R sub E's. And so you can see above 1, barely below 1, well above 1, barely below 1, barely above 1, barely above 1, above 1, above 1, and below 1. And so what we're trying to do is keep everything below 1 here. We're trying to keep the proportion positive low, and we're trying to keep the case counts low. We're not doing a particularly great job with the case counts right now, but I think it will hopefully get better in the future. Although, a jump like this, I don't know if you can really see this, but this 1,300 cases on November 9th is a real problem, and maybe a harbinger of things to come. And this just shows you what San Francisco's R sub E looks like. And you can see it's, these are different estimates, and so this is a kind of a composite estimate. It's been over 1 it was over 1 for a couple of weeks, and then finally dropped down below 1 on Sunday. That's epidemiology. I'm going to talk about prevention. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to not have this happen. This is all infectious disease deaths per 100,000 per year in the United States. This is the 1918-1919 influenza. This is HIV, okay? So this was an enormous shock to the system. And and it spread around the world with the armistice, with troops going to Europe for World War I and coming home from Europe after World War I. And it really was a worldwide pandemic that was facilitated by what they thought of as modern transportation. So we have 2 goals. One is to minimize the number of new cases by decreasing R sub E, and also trying to deal with super spreaders, which is, that letter is K for the dispersion constant. And then we want to flatten and prolong the outbreak to assure the adequacy of healthcare resources, so if we spread it out over time, and to buying time for antivirals and eventually vaccine, which we've done pretty successfully. Now we have a relatively limited number of non-pharmaceutical interventions. At the individual level, we can wear masks, we can maintain social distance or physical distance, we can stay home if we're sick, because if you're sick and coughing, the masks don't work very well. And we can wash our hands or use alcohol. That's really around fomite transmission, probably a bit overblown. What are our public health interventions? Well, we can do shelter in place. A cordon sanitaire is a public health term, which means you put a belt around an area and don't let people in or out, which is what the Chinese do when they basically will go into if there are cases, they'll go into a city, they'll lock it down, not let anybody in or out, and they'll test everybody to identify cases. We do case investigation and contact tracing. And the reason we do all of this stuff is so we can isolate people who are infected and infectious, and quarantine people who have been exposed and are likely to develop infection. We can do testing, and I'll talk more about testing. We can do a lot of focused testing, and that's going to become, as the technology improves, we're going to get better and better and better at that. And then in indoor spaces, we can increase ventilation and change filtration systems on air handlers, so either air conditioners or heaters. Now this is a great lesson. So, 1918, San Francisco, Port City, 350,000 people. They knew the influenza was coming because it had happened in the spring. Elaborate plans for what they're going to do when influenza came. It came in mid-September, on a guy who was coming from Chicago on the train. He was isolated at the Palace Hotel, but it got out and spread around the city quite quickly. The Board of Health got on the case and issued a mask ordinance that everybody had to wear masks if they were out in public, if you were over the age of 2, which explains this little guy down here. Okay? Everybody had to wear masks. These masks were made out of gauze. They were 2-ply, and they worked quite well. People hated them. They hated them. And, there were maybe 1,000 deaths at that point in time, by around the time of the armistice, which was 102 years ago today, just to point that out. So the Board of Health backed off and said, okay, we're going to get rid of masks. And on noon on November 21st, 10 days after the armistice was signed, 1918, all the whistles blew, the sirens blew in San Francisco, and people threw away their masks. And there was this complete rock out party all up and down Market Street. The Chronicle described it as having a sea of gauze on the sidewalks and in the streets and in the gutters. So it was like great success story. The only problem was that come April, there were another at least 1,400 deaths. As much as anything, here you have a story of where they're doing pretty well with masks to prevent death. Everybody got rid of the masks and they doubled their death count. It's a more complicated story than that, but it's worthwhile to listen to because it has real parallels with today. Masks reduce airborne transmission. They reduce them from the person who's infected. And remember, 40% of people are asymptomatic, right? And of the 60% who are symptomatic, a third of them transmit or are infectious. If you think of the 3 days, they're most infectious days, 4, 5, and 6. One of those days, day 4, they are pre-symptomatic. They haven't developed symptoms yet. So that's why we want people to wear masks outside, because maybe 60% of transmission is from people who are asymptomatic, the 40% plus a third of the other 3 days, right, for people who are symptomatic. The other thing is that if you wear a mask, you protect yourself. It cuts down on your chances of inhaling particles, and works really well. And the third thing that Professor Monica Gandhi here has worked a lot on is that we also think that if you're wearing masks, if you do get infected, you're going to get infected with a smaller number of viral particles, and as a consequence have less severe disease. So that's like 3 reasons to wear masks. The British modeled this out, and this is looking at 4 options. 80% people wear masks. Social distance continues after lockdown is lifted. This is a May 31st lockdown. The total infected population is 2.5%, and it takes 276 days till its virus is extinguished. Here's the yellow 50% masks. Social distancing continues, and you end up with 7.4% of the population infected, and it's not going down. Blue, you have a lockdown instead of universal masking, which continues indefinitely. It takes 369 days to eliminate it, and it takes and you end up with 5.5% of the population infected. And then the gray is social distancing after lockdown ends. So try and do it all with social distancing, and you can see that doesn't work very well at all. So of these, the masking seems to be really, really, really important in terms of cutting down on spread and elimination. People don't wear masks in large parts of the United States. This is looking at the proportion of public wearing masks most or all of the time. And this is exactly where all these outbreaks are going on right now. Okay? California is pretty good. The West Coast is pretty good. The East Coast is pretty good. Illinois and Minnesota are good, but not quite good enough. And then this is the percentage of people surveyed by this group at Carnegie Mellon who knows someone who's sick. So that's kind of a rough estimate of how much disease there is. So here in North and South Dakota, actually the 2 most heavily impacted states per capita, almost 40% of people knew someone who'd had COVID. Out here, it seems relatively uncommon. Up here in this this is Vermont. In New Hampshire and Maine, it seems relatively less common as well. So this is another kind of gross estimate of mask wearing and cases. And you can, us loving math and graphs, we plot this out. The proportion of the public wearing masks, proportion of people wearing masks in public most or all of the time, versus the proportion who know someone with COVID symptoms. Again, this is like disease incidence. You can see what this relationship looks like here, with South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming way up here, and then California's way down here, where we have high levels of masking and relatively fewer people infected, at least per capita. This is great. This is on the old Key Line, and I think this is in Rockridge, but it's certainly in Oakland. We know that part. And this woman didn't quite get the message about covering your nose. We come back to say a couple of words about other things. So masks are good. Now I talk about social distancing. Social distancing is important, and I'm showing you these data, early data from Wuhan, that were published in I think late January. Late February. And here are these periods of time. Okay, you didn't have anything going on here. There's nothing happening here. The R sub E was 3.54. Here it was 3.32. They locked down on January 23rd. It fell in the first week to 1.18, and then by the second and third weeks to 0.51, and subsequently to 0.28. So this is this huge drop-off in R sub E's that was directly observed in Wuhan through their forced shelter-in-place program, which is a lot more draconian than ours. Here's some modeling from Germany that would suggest that with relatively sort of, it kind of depends on how stringent they are with lockdown, and if they get to the really stringent part, you can see that it starts to, that the predicted number of cases levels off, whereas with these other sort of less severe bands, you have increasing cases, and here with this sort of in-between kind of interventions. This is Professor Gandhi's favorite study. I've heard her talk about it ad nauseum. 3 companies of in the Swiss Army, companies like companies of soldiers, 120, right? In 2 companies, there was no social distancing or masks. 30% developed illness, 62% got infected. In the 3rd company, there was either social distancing or masks, so one or the other. 15% of the people got infected and 0% got ill. So that's another kind of indirect measure that suggests social distancing as well as masking has a role. Now, California's blueprint for a safe economy, this is what all these colors are and stuff. This was the original one, by the way, before you panic. This is based on, this is really about social distancing. All the interventions that are keyed off of the county level of risk have to do with keeping people apart and not mixing between groups. So, for instance, indoor dining, gymnasia, those kinds of things are not allowed if you're here in these highest risk tiers. So this is an example of how somebody's taken the social distancing parameters and put them into place. And this is driven by numbers of cases and the proportion of tests that are positive. So now let's talk about testing. So there are a whole variety of considerations in testing. One is the accuracy. How well does the test perform? How well does it detect cases? That's sensitivity. And how well does it differentiate cases from non-cases? That's specificity. Some other considerations: how frequently are you going to test? So the test they were using in the White House to screen people with on a one-time basis was not designed for that. And it was also not designed for asymptomatic people. And that's how the person who got in, who was the super spreader and that kind of early period of hyperinfectiousness. We talk about turnaround time, and we hear about point-of-care testing. Another consideration: who collects the specimen? Is it home collection, or is it collected in a clinic or something else, right? Drive-throughs. What's the biological fluid we test? So nasopharyngeal or oropharyngeal swabs, which are deep swabs, and they're uncomfortable. Tracheal aspirates, which truly are uncomfortable. Anterior nasal swabs, right here. The oral sulcus, which is here, between your cheek and gum, or saliva. The NBA used saliva testing. You just spit into a straw, or actually into a pipette as it ended up. And that was enough for them to be able to test. And then another consideration, whether you combine specimens from multiple people together with the thought that if it's negative, everybody's negative. And that has some math to it, and it's not a bad idea, but it's not a great idea if it's, say, more than 20% prevalence. You have to go back and retest everything if one of them, if the pool is positive. So these are the kind of the big tests that we have up here. We can look for RNA, right? And there are 2 ways to do that. These are PCRs, right? Both of these are PCR tests. One is a quantitative test. This is real-time PCR. This turns positive 3 days post-exposure. You can get the results in 4 to 8 hours, and it's highly, highly, highly sensitive. This is the gold standard. There are another series of things, both isothermal and loop-mediated isothermal amplification, which is a qualitative test. That has the ability, can be done as a point-of-care test, and they have rapid turnaround. They're somewhat less sensitive. They have You need more RNA, more viral particles to detect this as a positive thing. Antigen tests for viral proteins. This is looking for RNA. These are looking for proteins, the coats, for instance. These turn positive 3 to 4 days post-exposure. They have very rapid, they have 15 minutes, but they have not high sensitivity. And these were the types of tests that were being used in the White House. And then finally, we have antibody tests where we can measure IgG to either the spike protein or to the capsule around the nucleus of the virus. Those don't turn positive until 12 days post-exposure. And it's, they're highly sensitive and that they can get the results in not unreasonable amounts of time. But it really comes down to these three. This is kind of the runoff. And it depends on what we're trying to do. There's a very interesting guy at the Harvard School of Public Health named Michael Minna. I kid you not. I kept thinking I had his name wrong and I was conflating him with the chef, but, whatever. What he said is look at a test, say, that has, say, an antigen test. And an antigen test, it doesn't turn positive until you're sort of up here, farther up on this curve. Because you have to have more RNA around in order to detect it, or more viruses around in order to detect it. Here, an antigen test, you're detecting protein, right? Down here, if you have a PCR test, this is gold standard. You're going to hit it right off the bat. You're in good shape. What he says is, okay, this is a test that costs $5 each. This is a test that costs $125. Why don't we just test everybody every 3 days, right? Because we'll hit this period if we're doing 3 days. Whereas if we do PCRs once a week, we're going to miss the most infectious part and are going to have a positive PCR because the PCRs stay up for a while, but they'll be out of the infectious period. So if you can isolate them all you want. It's not going to make any difference in terms of disease control. Whereas if you do antigens constantly, you're going to hit this early peak and you're going to be able to act on it in terms of isolation, contact tracing much more rapidly. I think this is a really interesting idea, and a lot of places are trying to put it into practice. What the White House did wrong was they were using it as a single test rather than doing it in series. Now, another thing you may have heard about in terms of disease control is herd immunity. Herd immunity is a term from veterinary medicine, and it refers to the proportion of the population that needs to have durable immunity. And durable is a big word here, before the viral spread stops. So the virus can't find a susceptible host is what it boils down to. And there's a formula for this, which is RE minus 1 over RE. And so if the RE is 3, remember I showed you that stuff from Wuhan where it was like 3.85? It's 3, the herd immunity would be a 3 minus 1 divided by 3, or 67%. And from a variety of outbreaks, including places like at San Quentin and Avenal State Prison, we think the herd immunity probably lies somewhere between 60 and 80%. You saw it when on that ship, the fishing ship I told you about, I think it was 83%. So those are kind of those closed things where nobody can really get away from each other. That may be overestimating where herd immunity lies, but we're probably talking in the sort of 60% to 70% range. This is a review that was done on herd immunity, and you get an idea. So measles, you need 95% of the population with a basic reproductive number of 14.5 for people to be immune from measles. From polio, it's closer to 85%. For smallpox in India, it was closer to a little bit below 80%. This is the H1N1, the darker green is the H1N1 influenza. They estimated SARS at around a little bit more than 70. And at least here, this guy estimated it SARS-CoV-2 at 60%. So it's an interesting phenomenon. It depends on what your basic, this is a different way of saying this, but what your effective reproductive number is, or this they have it here is basic reproductive number, which is related. So same idea. The number of secondary cases per primary case. And here they estimated at 60%. I actually think it's probably a little higher. You have heard people, including current members of the White House task force, say that we should just let everybody get infected, and that's a way we can achieve herd immunity. Well, to start with, the immunity is not necessarily durable. This is a much longer story, but for the other coronaviruses, immunity lasts sort of one respiratory season. It lasts for, a few, several months. It may last as long as 18 months in some series, but it goes away unless you're being constantly restimulated. So, and we have these cases of reinfection, which is a concern. And so I think that the idea here is that we probably can't count on durable immunity in the absence of a vaccine. The second thing is even in places that tried to achieve herd immunity like Sweden, they never got above 10%. And to go from 10% to 70% will equate with massive amounts of mortality in older people and people with comorbid conditions. And oh, by the way, 60% of the adult population has comorbid conditions. Okay, now to the good news. So the way to get to herd immunity is through vaccines, and vaccines are starting to come off the line. They're different approaches. So there are nucleic acid vaccines, so-called messenger RNA vaccines. That's the Moderna vaccine. That's the Pfizer vaccine that had the big splash on Monday. There are inactivated virus vaccines, which is the way we do lots of viruses. So the Salk vaccine, for instance, is an inactivated poliovirus vaccine. A lot of the influenza vaccines that we use are inactivated viruses. You basically just take the whole virus and kill it, and then inject it, and it gets and its protein coats are intact. So the immune system sees it. It creates antibodies. It creates memory cells. We have live attenuated vaccines. This is like oral polio vaccine, right? These are vaccines that are in viruses that are closely related to the agent you're trying to prevent, and so that when you stimulate immunity to that virus, to this vaccine virus, it'll carry over to the naturally occurring virus. And this is polio as an example. Smallpox is an example where we actually immunize people with cowpox. We can have protein or peptide subunit vaccines, where we're just trying to inject pieces of the virus of the outer coat of the virus to stimulate immunity to the outer coat of the virus, which is what the immune system sees. This is, for instance, why we do hepatitis B vaccine. And then we have viral vectored vaccines, and we only have one of these, and that's for Ebola. And this is using another virus, a benign virus like adenovirus, say. So that's the example of AstraZeneca or the Janssen and J&J vaccines, which are use a different virus to get into a cell, and as part of its and these are benign viruses, but as part of its genetic makeup, they've inserted a piece of RNA that will code for the spike protein. So the idea with these things is that we'll get, especially with the nucleic acid and the viral vectored proteins, is that you'll set up this sort of shop, and the cells, which won't be damaged because these are it's either just a tiny piece of RNA or it's a benign infection, will churn out on a fairly continuous basis spike proteins that the immune system will see. And so instead of waning off over time, because it'll be constantly stimulated, you'll have robust immunity going forward. Now, we know that there are, I'll talk about this in a second, there are 6 vaccines that are already in use. Now, unfortunately, you need to join the People's Liberation Army in China or the Russian military in order to get them. But there are 6. I think 3 are in China, 1 in Russia, and 2 in the United Arab Emirates. They're not. They seem to have taken a few shortcuts. We have at least 4 in trials, late phase 3 trials here in the United States. Those are the Moderna, the Pfizer, the AstraZeneca, and the J&J ones. Now, so the big news was that Pfizer and its German partner BioNTech announced on Monday an interim analysis of their mRNA vaccine, and it showed 90% efficacy in preventing infection at 7 days after the second dose. So that means we took 100 people who got it. Okay, this is a more complicated calculation than this, but I'm going to give it to you in relatively simple. That 90% of them did not develop infection when they were naturally exposed to the virus. There were no serious safety concerns. These are big trials. They typically involve tens of thousands of people. They have a target of 164 COVID cases, or actually infections, SARS-CoV-2 infections, for the trial endpoint, and they've accumulated 94 so far, and accumulating 70 more is not going to take very long. So we would expect this to kind of be finished, have an application to the FDA for emergency use authorization, and to be released in mid-ish December. The problems with this vaccine are, first of all, it's going to be relatively limited stock. It's Operation Warp Speed has done an interesting thing, which is to take these candidate vaccines and start manufacturing them before the trials are finished. So they're just taking a risk that they're going to work. If they do work, we have a stock ready to go. But it's still relatively limited. These are all 2-dose series. So if they have 100 million doses ready, that's enough for 50 million people. So it raises the question about who gets vaccinated first. Another question is, how well does it perform in people with risk of severe disease? So the elderly, people with underlying conditions. That's why they have to completely finish the trial, get out to the 164, so they'll have data on this point here. And then finally, these are not easy to move around. This is really complicated logistics. It requires refrigeration or freezing at minus 70 degrees centigrade, up to about 24 hours before administration. So there's a lot of logistics about moving this from point A to point B, getting it ready, and having it kept at the right temperature until you're ready to administer it. President Trump has tasked the Army with dealing with this. And I was talking to my colleague today at Stanford, and she said they were coming in to set up trailers and stuff across from the stadium at Stanford and the eucalyptus groves in order to set up vaccine distribution centers. So this is what the future holds, and this is the most likely scenario, and this is in terms of cases, right? So this is cases per day. Here's 300,000. Here's 200,000 cases per day. We're down here right now we're at about a little more than 100,000 cases a day, and we're gonna the expectation. This is in the absence of everything kind of continuing on as it is it will be pushing 300,000 cases a day by the 1st of January. If everybody acts like it's Florida and there are no restrictions, it's going to be a lot higher. If everybody acts like California, Northern California, I should say, and we remain relatively locked down with a lot of mask wearing, it can be significantly lower. This is really true for mortality as well. You heard the candidates sort of throw these numbers around, but here with masking and pretty strict adherence to masking and social distancing, the expectation is you could prevent 100,000 deaths by January 1st in the absence of masking, and everybody pretending everything's fine. You're going to end up maybe with more than 400,000 deaths cumulatively by the 1st of January. So what's the future hold? From now until spring, the vaccines are not widely available. They'll only be used for the highest risk populations. We're well into our third wave, and that's here in the West without the colleges and universities really coming back onto campus, and without high schools and middle schools reopening. That's where most of the transmission will take place. There'll be continued need for masking, social distancing, and reopening businesses will depend on local epidemiology and politics, when we hope we continue to have low mortality. In the spring through the late summer, the vaccines will go out to the general public. There'll be variable uptake due to vaccine hesitancy and frank refusal, and whether transmission can be sustained depends on what the vaccine coverage is, what the efficacy is, and whether we are avoiding things like mass crowd events with super spreading, how many people are wearing masks, all those kinds of things. So we'll likely need to have vaccination levels in excess of 60 to 70% to achieve herd immunity, and if you have a 90% effective vaccine, you need to add 10% on top of that. If we end up with low coverage, if it's much less than 60%, we may end up with a two-tiered system of people who've been vaccinated, who have green thing on their cell phones, or who haven't been, right? So you have green, you can go into the movie theater, red, you can't. Okay? And we're still going to need masks and social distancing, and we hope that people end up looking like this with everybody masked until we can get everybody vaccinated. And then I just wanted to end on, because I'll be asked this question, I know, about what to do for Thanksgiving. The simple answer is don't. Okay, whatever you want to do, don't do it. Keep Thanksgiving within your families, within your current households. Avoid mixing, and that means the kids coming home from college too, unfortunately. I know everybody's going to do it anyway, but that's the real advice. People are going to be coming, if the kids are coming home from college, they need to get tested, right? They probably should be tested before they leave and when they get in. If you're having a couple of households together, do it outdoors instead of indoors. Have people at separate tables for separate households. Don't do the father or the bride routine of bouncing around between tables and knocking over drinks. Get people to wear masks. I say, think about serving all the food in the kitchen and then handing it out, passing it out, rather than everybody kind of getting together at a buffet or passing things around. It just brings on a lot of additional contact. I also think that this is the time to shop online and have the food delivered and stay out of Whole Foods on Wednesday. And then I wouldn't live up to my public health spurs unless I reminded you not to cook the stuffing inside the turkey. That's a risk of salmonella. And if you cut up poultry like giblets on cutting boards, make sure you thoroughly clean them before you cut up foods like crudités or salads that will be eaten raw. So with that advice, I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, George. That was really spectacular. We do have a number of questions. One really interesting question has to do with durable immunity. Right. And what determines who gets durable immunity, and how do we know that the vaccine is going to be more durable than natural infection or vice versa?
Well, because the vaccine, a lot of times durable immunity is a function of getting re-exposed to naturally occurring virus. So one of the reasons the smallpox vaccine worked so well in the 19th century is that people were continuously getting re-exposed to it, whereas now it doesn't seem to work so well because there's no continuous re-exposure. The reason that the vaccines may work better than naturally occurring virus is they're going to provide a constant stream of these spike proteins into the bloodstream and into the respiratory tract. And so that the immune system will see it all the time, and they'll keep up high levels of immunity, as opposed to getting it once, having it go away, and not getting re-stimulated, possibly.
Something totally different. What is your thinking about the seasonality of the disease? We're used to viruses that are so active in the winter and then calm down. Yeah. And what's happening in the Southern Hemisphere, and what are we learning about the seasonality?
So this is probably not a seasonal virus. It's certainly not a seasonal virus now. It may become one in the future. Seasonality is determined by a lot of things, But at least the way I think about it, it's the seasonality is a function of being indoors. And when you get to come outdoors in the summer or in the late spring, you see the winter viruses drop off. What we've seen in the Southern hemisphere, interestingly, is almost no flu season at all. And that's been ascribed, the reason is first of all, there's not a new flu mutation this year to deal with. But the second thing, and everybody's wearing masks and maintaining social distance. And so there's been an astronomically small flu season this year. And that's probably a good thing. There is co-infection. You can get flu and SARS-CoV-2 co-infection. But the real reason is we don't want the ICUs filled up with people who have a preventable disease, influenza, who have not gotten vaccinated or are vaccine failures, while we still have to have, maintain the capacity for SARS-CoV-2 infections. So if you haven't been vaccinated, get vaccinated. It's really important. And while that is the Southern Hemisphere's experience, don't bank on it.
Good advice. What do you think is happening in Africa?
That was a damn good question. I think in more temperate parts of Africa, like South Africa, they've had experiences much like we have. In more tropical parts of Africa, they really don't, that's funny. They've obviously seen some, but it's for some reason in Tanzania specifically, and I'm trying to pick this apart. We've been trying to pick this apart with a student. We're just not seeing it. So early on, there was a big rash of deaths, government ministers, senior people, but the same kind of pattern, the elderly and stuff. And now it's like almost nobody. And the big teaching hospital in Dar es Salaam doesn't have many patients in it. And, you think maybe they're just not bothering to diagnose it, but no, there are no patients that sort of fit the profile in the hospitals either. So I think maybe it's just because the population's so young. And, the African population is so much younger than ours. And, maybe they really aren't, if they're getting it, it's largely asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. And we're just not seeing it for whatever reason in older people. Another reason is people are outdoors more, and maybe there's less chance of transmitting it.
I have a question to get back to the issue about testing. You implied that if someone is a college student is in a high-risk community and coming back to the Bay Area, they should get tested. And some colleges are doing a lot of that. Some are doing less of it. Yeah. And then I also get asked by patients, what if they, for whatever reason, even after you recommend that they not travel back east, for some reason they have to go. In a low prevalence environment, should they get tested? And if so, before they travel, when they get back, and so on?
Yeah. So CDC would say you have to quarantine 14 days on both ends of it. That's what their advice is. So you might want to not pay attention to that. That's probably overkill. What I think you get, so, what we're dealing with is this window period, this 3-day window period between exposure and when your test turns positive. So I think kids coming back from college, and I think you have to basically assume every college is a hotbed of infection. I don't know who saw the end of the Notre Dame Clemson game on Saturday, but there'll be 2,000 cases by Wednesday, by today, for sure. So what I say is, so the safest thing to do is not do it, right? Get tested, lay low, wear masks, don't come and try and, avoid contact with people, don't go to any fraternity parties, fly home, come home, quarantine in your house, which means no contact, right? Wear masks if you have to go out, and then get tested, say maybe 3 days later. And that way you're dealing with that window period of 3 days. Or you could wait a few more days and say, let's just assume that the exposure could have been on the airplane. That's pretty unlikely, by the way, on these shorter flights. And then you wait more like 5 days after they got back to test them. I had my daughter test herself, go to Kaiser and get tested the day after she got back. And she got tested a couple of days beforehand in Virginia. So that's kind of how I approach it. Now, if you have to go back east for whatever reason, I think it's, you're playing with fire. I mean, my basic, advice is don't do it. That's why we have Zoom. But if you have to go back and visit elderly parents, for instance, I think you need to be prepared to quarantine, to use a combination of testing before travel and after travel, and quarantining until you get a second negative result before you really kind of enter their bubble. And you need to be outside of their bubble until then. And then when you come back to San Francisco, you come back to San Francisco and do whatever you want. It depends on if you're living with your 95-year-old mother-in-law, then you probably get caught in the reverse of that too.
There was a question about the something totally different about the mutations from the minks in Denmark, and
it's my new favorite story.
Yeah. Where are the and how much is mutation going to turn out to be a big issue with this virus?
One of the problems with viruses, especially zoonotic viruses, is that it can get into other species. And you remember the story about the tigers at the Bronx Zoo? That's because felines have ACE2 inhibitors in their upper airways, as do muscelids. Muscelids are things like otters and ferrets and minks and sables and stuff, muskrats, wolverines. And they have very similar kind of receptor architecture as humans. So these minks got infected, and then they kind of probably passed it around in these big enclosed populations, which are like a cruise ship, in many ways. And they got, and they've started to adapt to minks. So the virus tries to, it gets more and more efficient for, transmission and replication in minks. And then it got something like 15 farmers who got infected with this variant strain. And that pushed all the alarm bells, because this is in humans, this was somewhat more pathogenic. At least that was the thought. And so what they've done is that they're in the process of culling the entire mink industry in Denmark with 15 million minks, and they're destroying the pelts. I hate to tell you, but that's that's what happens when you have this sort of massive animal husbandry, and one of these viruses gets loose in it. They also have other. There's a Spanish industry. There were some farms in Utah where they had to cull all the animals, and so it's, that's what's going on. And they think they've also locked down all of northern Denmark. I mean, hard lockdown, and they're going to contain this, and they're not going to let anybody get out who's infected and start spreading it from human to human. Right now, it's mink to human, and it stops. But there's concern is that it could be human to human transmission.
We have a lot of other good questions. I think we don't quite have the time for all of them, but maybe if you're sitting with a patient who is, say, 65 years old and in generally good health, but has one or two chronic conditions, and they're asking, what can I do? How tight a shelter must I do? What are some things that you would advise them to do? You've touched on flying, indoor restaurants, gyms, and so forth. But, and I guess you're not doing most of those, but what are some of the other things? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I'm flattered that you think I'm 65 years old. I wish I were.
I wasn't talking about you.
Oh, okay. Well, you got to wear masks.
The next patient I'm going to see.
Yeah, okay. You got to wear masks. I encourage people to who are going to be exposed, like going on an airplane, to wear glasses. And, you guys all wear safety glasses, with the sides and stuff. But there was actually a study in China that said it reduced the risk of being hospitalized 13-fold if you had myopia, and had to wear glasses more than 8 hours a day. And that speaks to conjunctival protection. I go to the old folks hour at Trader Joe's, I think it cuts down exposure a lot. I'm really conscious of exposure and avoid situations in which there could be, like a lot of people walking around with no masks, just turn around and walk out of the place. So I think you have to really go the extra yard to avoid exposure. And that means wearing masks, wearing glasses, and really avoiding indoor spaces to the greatest extent possible.
So no no Michael Minna yet.
Oh, the other Michael Minna. Yeah, no.
There's one last question about masks. How big a difference is there between different masks in the non-medical settings?
So I have my props here. This is an N95 mask, okay? This is from Home Depot. This is not the one to get because it has this thing here, which is an exhaust valve. That means if you have this, you're going to be exhausting all the virus out, right? So you don't want the ones with these things on. These are complicated to use. They have to be fit tested by somebody who knows what they're doing. So it has to really fit tightly. You can't have a beard. I mean, I realize, Bobby, you may be cheating on this a little bit, but you can't have a beard and have these things fit correctly. So then you have surgical masks, which work pretty well. People have cloth masks, which with 2-ply. They can have filters built into them. Those work quite well. Bandanas, gaiters, 2-ply maybe, probably okay, but not as great. So when I go out, I wear surgical masks. If I were going to fly on an airplane, I'd wear an N95 if I had one, or wear both if you had only one I have is this one with the valve on it, I'd wear a surgical mask underneath it. And there's another good paper that came out last week that looked at pulse oximetry in older people who exercised with masks on. So they exercised them, they checked their before and after. They put a mask on them, checked it before and after. And actually, when they put the mask on them, their oxygenation went up. So, I mean, it wasn't significantly, but it did go up. So that's the good news. You can, these aren't going to cut down your oxygenation. You're not going to think more slowly. You're not going to make mistakes. Just keep your mask on.
Well, George, I think we need to stop. I know you could go on forever, and I think our audience probably could as well, but we should respect the time. And I just want to thank you so much for tonight and for everything you've done, even since before the COVID pandemic, but certainly during it. And it's really been a remarkable run, and we all are tremendously grateful for your work. So thank you for tonight, and stay well. And for everyone in the audience, also stay safe and take care of each other, and we'll see you again next week. So thank you very much.